Good evening, everyone. Our first guest today is the winner of the Philip K. Dick Memorial Special Award, the Whitney Award, the New York Times Bestselling Author Award. I guess that's not a one word, but I like the word awards. David Farland, also known as Dave Wolverton. David will be giving us a reading from the first book in his Rune Lord series, and then give an interview with a special guest host this evening, 2 times Hugo Award-winning writer and fanzine editor, Christopher J. Garcia, or as I like to call him, and pretty much everybody calls him, Chris. I first met Chris at the San Jose Worldcon. He was emceeing the masquerade. I was helping run the masquerade, and I will never forget this moment where this little girl was coming on stage and she was preparing. She was truly putting herself into the zone, going into her pose, and then tech, unfortunately, we had good tech, but sometimes things go wrong, played the wrong music 3 times. And the way he handled that got me to respect him for life. And to be fair and to be honest, we really got to be friends because of Facebook. Say what you will of Facebook, it does work for that. So right now he's working on Journey Planet and on his podcast, Fantasy Film 101. Hello, Chris.
Oh no.
Chris, you with us? Are we having tech problems again? Are we having a rewind of San Jose?
They're not tech problems, they're tech opportunities.
Fair enough.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. And I had blocked out that masquerade for a long time, and thanks for bringing that up. No, it's great to be here. And you mentioned Journey Planet, Hugo nominated this year.
No, I think you've been Hugo nominated 24 times.
Yeah, actually, that means I believe I'm tied with that guy who beat me one time, Fred Pohl, on the all-time rankings. Not that I pay attention to that stuff, but in order to get tied with Mike Dwyer, I'll have to keep doing this until I'm 107. So I'm going to do it.
Do it. Well, thank you for coming on the show. You're kind of our Toastmaster coming in for special occasions, and we appreciate you, just so you know.
Oh, thank you. And one of the best things about stuff like this with Zoom is that it allows me to actually use my deep knowledge of computers to completely wreck everything. So at some point, I guarantee things are going to crash, because that's what happens when I get near machines.
That's okay. We're easygoing here. We're truly just having fun. And I'll tell you this, starting this broadcast, doing the simplest of things, such as starting an email account or whatever, technology doesn't just work. It's a lot of work to make technology work.
Oh, yeah. I spent 20 years as a computer historian. And the ultimate lesson that I learned is that when it comes to computers, this too shall pass. Nothing stays around for very long, which for me makes me very happy.
Fair enough. We do have something of talking today, so you shall not pass. Well, you will, you're hosting. Anyway, we also have a reading from our very own Karen Castelletti today. Our second guest for the evening would be a leadership professional and good friend, Stephen Kelner, professional. Therefore, let's treat him professionally. And in the first of a series of talks on leadership, styles and practices of the heroes we like throughout our own favorites, he'll be focusing on many, many different heroes and giving us their professional and leadership styles and what we can learn from them. But today, he's focusing on the one true king of Gondor, Aragorn. And we'll be taking questions throughout the show. Just type into the chat and our team will pick the questions up. We can't promise to get to all of the questions, but we will do as many as we can. It's a busy evening, and we're going to get straight into it. I'm Gadi Evron, and this is Essence of Wonder. And our first guest of the evening has been the mentor to several of the best-selling, and many others among me, best-selling authors in the world. And he's been a kind of personal inspiration to me on a number of levels of how to write, how to handle yourself, how to conduct yourself in business, how to be a professional. I kind of repeating myself, but I truly believe that. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, David Farland. Hello, Dave. And here we go with the technical difficulties.
Oh,
Dave,
here we go.
Oh,
there we go. How's that? Yes, okay.
Now, perfect.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you. Okay, yeah, I'm happy to be here. So shall I
Sure.
go into the reading right now?
Well, I do want to mention a couple of things. Later in the interview, we'll have the chance to talk about Tale of Tales, the much anticipated ninth book in the Rune Lord series. Can't wait for
Mhm.
that. And also the Apex Writing Workshop. So I wanted to make sure you talk about that with us.
Sure.
And also, well, you know what? I think I can talk about you a lot later and introduce you and what you have done. But for right now, just go for it. Over to you, David.
Okay. Well, this is from my Rune Lord series. I'm going to read from book one, and I started writing this many years ago. When I started writing, I wrote my first book and won an award and became a bestseller. And my publisher asked what I wanted to write next, and I said, "Well, I'd like to do a big fantasy novel." And she said, "Dave, you're a best-selling science fiction writer. We don't want fantasy from you." So for my 10th birthday as a writer of science fiction, I decided to write a big fantasy. And that kind of took over my life. I really kind of got into what I love. So my first novel was called The Rune Lords, and I'm just going to go ahead and read from that. Chapter 1, It Begins in Darkness. Effigies of the Earth King festooned Castle Silveresta. Everywhere the effigies could be seen, hanging beneath shop windows, standing upright against the walls of the city gates, or nailed beside doorways, any place where the Earth King might find ingress into a home. Many of the figures were crude things crafted by children, a few reeds twisted into the form of a man, often with a crown of oak leaves in its hair. But outside the doors of the shops and taverns were more ornate figures of wood, the full size of a man, often elaborately painted and coiffed in fine green wool traveling robes. In those days, it was said that on Hassenfest Eve, the spirit of the earth would fill the effigies, and the Earth King would waken. At his wakening, he would protect the families for another season and help bear the harvest home. It was a festive season, a season of joy. In those days, the father of a home would play the role of the Earth King, or perhaps a grandfather or uncle if the home was fatherless. Thus, at dawn on the first day of Hassenfest, adults received flasks of new wine or kegs of stout ale. For the young girls, the Earth King brought toy dolls woven of straw and wildflowers, while boys might get swords or ox carts carved from ash. All these bounties delivered by the Earth King represented but a token of the Earth King's wealth, the vast hoards of the fruits and fields of the forest, the vast hoards of the fruits of the forest and of the field, which legend said he bestowed on those who loved the earth. So the homes and shops around the castle were all adorned that night, on the 19th day of the month of harvest, 4 days before Hassenfest. All the shops were clean and well stocked for the autumn fair that would shortly come. The streets lay barren, for the dawn was approaching. Indeed, aside from the city guards and the few nursing mothers, the only one who had reason to be up so late of night were the king's bakers, who at the very moment were drawing the foam off the king's ale and mixing it with their dough so that the loaves would rise by dawn. True, the eels were running on their annual migration in the River Wye, so one might imagine few fishermen to be out that night, but the fishermen had emptied their wicker net eel traps an hour past midnight and had delivered kegs of live eels to the butchers for skinning and salting well before the second watch. Outside the city walls, the greens south of Castle Silveresta were dotted with dark tents, for caravans from Indapal had come north to sell the harvest of summer spices. The camps outside the castle were quiet, but for the occasional braying of a donkey. The walls of the city were shut, and all foreigners had been escorted from the merchants' quarter hours ago. No men moved in the street at all at that time of night, only a few Farron. Thus, there was no one to see what transpired in a dark alley. Even the king's farseer, who had endowments of sight from 20 people and stood guard on the old Braxery above the Dedicate's Keep, could not have spotted movement down in the narrow streets of the merchant quarter. But in Cat's Alley, just off the Butterwalk, 2 men struggled in the shadows for control of the night. Could you have seen them, You might have been reminded of tarantulas in battle, arms and legs twisting in frenzy as the knife flashed upward, scuffling as feet groped for purchase on the worn cobblestones, both men grunting and straining with deadly intent. Both men dressed in black. Sergeant Drays of the King's Guard wore the black livery embroidered with the silver boar of House Silveresta. Drays' assailant wore a baggy cloth cotton burnous in a style favored by the assassins out of Muyatin. Though Sergeant Drays outweighed the assassin by 50 pounds, and though Drays had endowments of brawn from 3 men and could easily lift 600 pounds over his head, he feared he could not win this battle. Only starlight lit the street, and precious little of that made its way here into Cat's Alley. The alley was barely 7 feet wide, and homes here stood 3 stories tall, leaning on sagging foundations till the awnings of the roofs nearly met a few yards above the Drays' head. Drays could barely see a damn thing back here. All he could make out of his assailant was the gleam of the man's eyes and teeth, a pearl ring in his left nostril, the flash of the knife. The smell of woodlands clung to his cotton tunic as fiercely as the sense of anise and curry held to his breath. No, Drays was not prepared for the fight here in Cat's Alley. He had no weapons and wore only the linen surcoat that normally fit over his ringmail, along with pants and boots. One does not go armed and armored to meet his lover. He'd only stepped in the alley a moment ago to make certain that the road ahead was clear of city guards when he heard a small scuffling behind a stack of yellow gourds by one of the market stalls. Drays had thought he'd disturbed a Farron as it hunted for mice or for some bit of cloth or water. He'd turned, or cloth to wear. He'd turned, expecting to see a pudgy, rat-shaped creature run for cover when the assassin sprang from the shadows. Now the assassin moved swiftly, grasping the knife tight, shifting his weight, twisting the blade. It flashed dangerously close to Drays' ear, but the sergeant fought it off till the man's arm snaked around, stabbing at Drays' throat. Drays managed to hold the smaller man's wrist back for a moment. "Murder! Bloody murder!" Drays shouted. A spy, he thought. I've caught a spy. He could only imagine that he disturbed the fellow in mapping out the castle's grounds. He thrust a knee into the assassin's groin, lifting the man in the air, pulled the man's knife arm full length and tried to twist it. The assassin let go of the knife with one hand, rabbit punched Drays in the chest. Drays' ribs snapped. Obviously, the little man also had been branded with runes of power. Drays guessed that the assassin had the brawn of 5 men, maybe more. Though both men were incredibly strong, endowments of brawn only increased strength to the muscles and tendons. They did not invest one's bones with superior hardness. So this match was quickly degenerating into what Drays would call a bone bash. He struggled to hold the assassin's wrists. For a long moment, they wrestled. Drays heard the deep voice shouts, "That way, I think, over there." It came from the left. A street over was Cheap Street, where the bunch houses did not press so close, and Sir William had built his new 4-story manor. The voice had to be from the city guard, the same guards Drays had been avoiding, whom Sir William bribed to rest beneath the lantern posts at the manor gate. "Cat's Alley!" Drays screamed. He only had to hold the assassin a moment more, make sure the fellow didn't stab him or escape. The southerner broke free in desperation, punched him again, high in the chest. More ribs snapped. Drays felt little pain. One tends to ignore such distractions when struggling to stay alive. In desperation, the assassin ripped the knife free. Drays felt a tremendous rush of fear, kicked the assailant's right ankle, and felt more than heard a leg shatter. The assassin lunged, knife flashing. Drays twisted away, shoved the fellow. The blade struck wide of its mark, slashed Drays' ribs, a grazing blow. Now Drays grabbed the fellow's elbow, had the man half turned around. The assassin stumbled, unable to support himself on his broken leg. Drays kicked the leg again for good measure and pushed the fellow back. Drays glanced frantically in the shadows for a sign of some cobblestones that he could loose from its mortar. Behind Drays was an inn called the Churn. Beside the flowing vines in the effigy of the Earth King at its front window sat a small butter churn. Drays tried to rush to the churn, thinking to grab its iron plunger and bludgeoned the assassin. He pushed the assassin, thought the smaller man would go flying. Instead, the fellow spun, one hand clutching Dre's surcoat. Dre saw the knife blade plunge. He raised an arm to block. The blade veered low and struck deep, slid up through his belly past his shattered ribs. Tremendous pain blossomed in Dre's gut, shot through his shoulders and arms. A pain so wide, Dre's thought the whole world would feel it with him. For an eternity, Dre stood, looking down. Sweat dribbled into his wide eyes. The damned assassin had slit him open like a fish, yet the assassin still held him, had thrust his knife up into the elbow to Dre's chest, working the blade toward Dre's heart, while his left arm clutched Dre's pocket, groping for something. His hand clutched at the book that in Dre's pocket, feeling it through the material of the surcoat. The assassin smiled. Dre's wondered, is that what you want? A book? Last night, that the city guard was escorting foreigners from the merchants' quarters, Dre's had been approached by a man from Tulistan, a trader whose tent was pitched near the woods. The fellow spoke little Rohavanish, had seemed apprehensive, and had only said, a gift for king. You give? Give to king? With much ceremonial nodding, Dre's had agreed, had looked at the book absently, the Chronicles of Owat, Emir of Tulistan, a thin volume bound in lambskin. Dre's had absently pocketed it, thinking it to pass it along at dawn. Dre's hurt so terribly now that he could not shout, could not move. The world spun. He pulled free of the assassin, tried to turn and run. His legs felt weak as a kitten's. He stumbled. The assassin grabbed his hair from behind, yanking his throat up to expose Dre's throat. Damn you, Dre's thought. Haven't you killed me enough? In one final desperate act, he yanked the book from his pocket, hurled it far into the street, into the butterwalk. There, on the far side of the street, a rosebush struggled up an arbor with a pile of barrels. Dre's knew this place well, could barely see the yellow roses on dark vines. The book skidded toward one. The assassin cursed in his own tongue, tossing Dre's aside, and staggered after the book. Dre's could hear nothing at all, but a dull buzz as he struggled to his knees. He saw movement at the edge of the street, the assassin groping among the roses. 3 larger shadows came rushing down the road from the left, the flash of drawn swords, starlight on glitting off iron caps. The city guard. Dre's pitched forward into the cobbled street. In the pre-dawn, a flock of geese honked as it made its way south through the silvery starlight, their voices sounding to him for all the world like the barking of a distant pack of dogs. Okay.
Thank you for that, David. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So while David gets ready for the interview coming up later with Chris, I am happy to introduce our second guest of the evening. And for me, and to the world, he is a master in the field of leadership. I've always turned to Steve on the topic. He developed an assessment methodology, several of these methodologies I actually believe, and being a thought leader, giants such as Egon Zehnder and Spencer Stewart. Steve is now on his own entrepreneurial journey. My condolences, Steve, having been there. You're welcome. And as the president and co-founder of Ascent, which is essentially fast turning into a leader in the leadership field, you're going to talk to us about leadership. A lot of using of that word today, styles. And I guess the heroes throughout our favorite works of fiction, starting with the king himself, Aragorn, from The Lord of the Rings. And how I guess, I'm not sure you're going to like me saying this, is leadership style would fit in today's modern corporate culture. So later, after you're done with this, we'll be talking with Chris, Karen, and David. But right now, it's my honor to introduce you, Stephen Kelner.
Thanks, Gadi. Okay, so hi, I'm Steve from Ascent Leadership Networks. We're going to talk about how Aragorn leads. And in the course of lots of research into the characteristics of executives, what makes this possible is that the fact that we've only found really 6 key capabilities that pretty much everyone needs. And in fact, none of them should be a surprise. They're all intuitively, they make sense. And I'll summarize them in a single sentence, which is a leader drives results over the strategic long term through people. The complicated part is the through people, because that includes collaboration, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and development. So this is different from kings, is my argument here. and why I think Aragorn stands out, because kings were almost by definition command and control. You obeyed or you died. Now, of course, there were good kings, but my point would be that Aragorn actually looks more like a modern leader who rules with the willing consent of the governed. So I think Aragorn was like that, and I can show you why. So I mentioned there are 6 different characteristics, and I'm just going to show you what those are. So, and I said all of them make sort of obvious sense, right? Results, strategy, collaboration, leading groups, aligning organizations for change, and developing people and organizations. And we find these happen over and over again. Everybody seems to have them. And what makes it measurable is the fact that we go back and we look at people's behaviors. What do people do? And when you look at that, you can compare it to what other people do. The patterns of what people do, their behaviors, are a reliable measure of what you can predict that they'll do in the future. What's more, those 6 things I showed you actually can be scaled. So there's different degrees of behavior. So there's a difference between, for example, someone who wants to meet goals versus someone who wants to beat goals versus someone who implements new systems so higher goals are possible. And with those 2 characteristics, the behaviors and the scaling, we can actually look at people compared to each other. So I went through Aragorn and all the things he did in Lord of the Rings where they applied to leadership. Some of them didn't. You know, his ability to swing an axe was not necessarily important. But also what was described when he was a king in the appendices. And I scored them. And then I said, okay, well, who can I compare this to? Well, I can compare it to modern executives, and I have some numbers which are effectively about 50,000 people from all over the world who are all in senior leadership positions. And I picked someone else from Lord of the Rings who's actually in a similar role, and that would be Denethor, the steward of Gondor, who ruled as a king while the line of the original kings had died out. And stewards have been doing that for centuries. So he behaved much more like a conventional king. And when I looked at the behaviors of what they did, here's what I found. Just share this. So those are the 6 again. So if you look at this, it's pretty obvious that, and by the way, 1 level on this is a standard deviation for the stat geeks among us. That means 1 level is significantly different. And what you see is that Aragorn at the top is actually significantly better than the average executive, very significantly, in fact, since the gap is 1, 2, 3, roughly 4 levels or more across all the capabilities. I added a 7th here, influence, because it actually kind of predicts how you engage with people. The average executive, you can see, is somewhere between 3 and 4. But when you look at poor Denethor, what he's good at is focusing on results, as in defending Gondor, and on strategy, like, okay, how can I defend Gondor? But not at as high a degree as Aragorn, who is thinking about the whole world. And in some, he actually comes out negative. Right. So what does that mean? Show you some examples. This is what it looks like in terms of the descriptors we use on the scales. So Aragorn is someone who works to beat goals. He goes beyond what is expected of him. Whereas Denethor is someone who only works to meet goals. I've already talked a little about strategy. Aragorn tried to reshape the future of the world by forming alliances. Here's collaboration. He was actually partnered with some of what we now call a partnership. Some of the people who fought for Mordor, he not only made peace agreements, but he pardoned them. He pardoned the Easterlings who had given themselves up, and he sent them away free. And he made peace with the peoples of Harad, who had been enemies of Gondor for centuries. So that's kind of an extraordinary level of collaboration. Whereas Denethor, by contrast, once said that when asked, what would you like to have happen by Gandalf, he said, I would like things as they were, to be lord of this city in peace, and leave my chair to a son after me who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. But if doom denies this to me, that I will have naught. For him, it was my way or the highway. And this shows in leadership as well. So leading groups, how do you manage a team? How do you give them goals? Aragorn did things like he made the son of Denethor a prince of Ithilien. So he actually elevated him and made him and put him in charge of protecting Gondor from what remained in Mordor. So he empowered him to act. He gave him a strategic objective and said, it's yours. Whereas Denethor, by contrast, now I'm going to turn this off now so we can look at each other. It said, for example, he was the Lord of Gondor, he said, is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy. And to him, there is no purpose higher than the good of Gondor. So that pattern here, you can see that Denethor is someone who basically said, I know what's right. I'm going to do what I think is right. And I don't care what anybody thinks or what anyone else involved. Aragorn was more modest. He was more humble. And he really genuinely tended to want to engage with people and be, you know, a ruler who ruled with permission rather than by demand. And of course, in corporations, people can always theoretically quit, or they can rebel in other ways. So it's much closer to what we would now think of as a modern leader. And just to be clear, there obviously been good kings in the past who could do stuff like this. And Julius Caesar actually would score pretty well on most of these, but it wasn't necessarily expected of them. So that's where I would argue that Aragorn is someone who kind of goes above and beyond. And he, instead of investing everything in his ego, as did Denethor, where Denethor said, I'm Lord of Gondor and that's it. Even when being crowned king of Gondor and Arnor, Aragorn asked that Gandalf actually crown him because, and this was his exact words from the book, he has been the mover and this is his victory. And he started by saying that by the labor and valor of many, I have come into my inheritance. And I think that makes him a much more positive kind of leader. And you could see where even in today's world, this is the kind of guy who's going to say, who's good? How can I let them have power because they're going to do good things that maybe I can't do by myself? And believe that power is, that power shared is power multiplied. And that's what we see in the very best leaders. So that's my take on Aragorn based on the scores I've got. Hope you find that interesting. Gadi, shall I give it back to you?
Thank you. That was interesting. I appreciate that. Was that fun for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I love this kind of stuff. I mean, I've assessed thousands of senior executives. It's got to have some entertainment value.
I have to admit, I mean, I should have put it in your introduction, but I still can't believe the numbers you get. You know, when I interview people, or used to interview people, and I believe that is true, but I also read about it a lot. The chances of getting any sort of assessment right is kind of random, and you managed to get 80% of your assessments right to the level of 2 years into the future where they're going to be in their career. I can't process that.
Well, we can predict who's going to be promoted a lot quickly versus who's going to be promoted a little versus who's just not going to get significantly better 5 years out with 85% accuracy. It's okay. It's an issue of measurement, and it's trainable, right? It's no magic. I mean, it's using science, and that's what's kind of fun about this is applying science to fantasy.
Any sophisticated enough technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? Anyway,
there we go.
Let's bring in Chris, Karen, and David. And I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts to add to the discussion or things to ask Steve at this point.
Steve, that was delightful. One of the things that stands out to me is that Aragorn as a king was maybe a bit unusually elected. Yeah. Relative to some other kings we've seen throughout history. How do you think that these traits or attributes helped him actually gain the authority to rule? Not only, do you feel he proved these traits in getting to the crown as well as, once he was ruling?
Yeah, it's a great point in that people wanted to work for him and with him, even people who weren't really in his kingdom. So, Legolas and Gimli were kind of stood in as examples at how much they referred to the love of the king. So they were willing to trust him, and that building of trust mattered. It's mentioned in Éomer too. At one point he even says, it's in the appendices, but King Éomer, right, says, I have loved you from the moment I saw you. And it's like, okay, maybe there's something else going on there. But also he was also a very transparent and honest and open person. So you understood that what he said he would do, and you could trust him. So yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. And that's true for leaders today, especially now in the era of social media, because if you do something that's out of line with what you are saying, people will find out, and it will corrupt the organization from top to bottom.
It's funny, as the guy here who has never read Lord of the Rings.
Hold on, stop everything. Get off
here?
the show.
All right. But no, I spent a large chunk of my life actually studying Silicon Valley leadership groups.
Yes.
In particular, the CEOs of companies from 1974 through 1988.
Interesting.
And an amazingly interesting group that 100% did not believe in management. They believed in leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And it is because of those chuckleheads that we have Scrum today. And which is my next TED Talk is going to be Scrum, all the cult, none of the protein deficiency. But one of the interesting concepts that I have been wondering about is, how does a leader of disparate factions manage to get results without denigrating one of the factions?
That's a great point. Actually, one thing Denethor does, by the way, is he denigrates people all the time. If you disagree with them, it's because you're wrong, or you're stupid, or you're weak. Well, part of it is you have to find what they do have in common. And that's what leaders do. They understand where people are coming from, and often they try to find what's the common thing that might underlie. Even if the way they're approaching things are different, they might say, look, we all want to get to this objective. Let's figure out a way that we can all agree. Right? And the assumption, they go in with the clear assumption that everybody has gifts. And if they're really good, they know what those gifts are already. So that way they can kind of draw people out based on what they're already good at. And that helps, because then if you can kind of delegate certain aspects to people who know what they're doing, it's, then you get a different kind of battle.
Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I have one more question about Aragorn. So we've talked about how he was in many ways actually a very effective leader. I'm curious what you think, if any, major missteps or poor leadership moments he made. What did he make any major fumbles along the way that stand out to you?
Tolkien described a few points where he thought he made tactical mistakes, like being trapped on Weathertop. In terms of being a leader, it's interesting that I think his weakness is his strength, is his humility. So there's a point where they're getting ready to march to Mordor basically to die in order to be a distraction for Frodo to throw the ring in the volcano, right? That's what he was facing. And he says, I don't claim any leadership right now. And I thought, okay, that's taking humility a little too far. And the prince from Prince Imrahil actually says, he is my king whether he wants it or not, and and goes on with it. But it's his strength in that he's willing to treat everybody as equals, right? He bans human beings from the Shire. But it's also his weakness that sometimes he seems just a little too modest for his own good. That would be my argument.
That's a good moment to highlight. I don't from everything I've known of leadership, I don't think it works quite that way.
Actually,
a mantle you can set down for a moment.
The thing about being a CEO, which Gadi should know, is you have all the authority and none of the ability, right? If you're running a big company, everything comes back to you. It's all your fault, but you still can't go build the widgets. So a certain level of humility in the face of what do people actually do matters a lot. And I say the best ones are very empowering. And I have seen a few who actually were very, chairman of PepsiCo a few generations back once said, I'm really not very good at anything but picking people and then getting out of their way.
Bill Gates is the exception.
Pardon?
Bill Gates is the exception. Bill Gates could build the widgets himself. He just didn't want to.
Well,
and he often did.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to cut this over short. I'll let David step in with a final note on the topic or on Tolkien or whatever he likes. But I will say a few things first. Number one, people, you can use the chat. We're happy to see what you're saying, and we are happy to answer your questions. And number two, next week, we have an entire show on leadership in crisis with chairs of WorldCon, security conventions and conferences, as well as Steve himself coming back. So Dave, any final words on this?
I've always been fascinated by Aragorn in that I think you're right. He did lead by example. He was out on the front lines, you know. He wasn't like, oh, someday I'm going to be king and I will save you all. It was, no, he's out there marching around out in the swamps with his broken sword, trying to heal his people. And he won the respect of the people by doing that. So much so that I've often wondered, you know, gosh, what more is there about him? Why did these people love and want to work with him so much? And I almost feel like as a character, he's not as filled out as I would like to see. I think that there's probably more histories that that could have been written and played with.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, thank you all. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you coming on this impromptu panel. And now
There is a question in the chat. I don't know if we want
there is. You know what?
Yes.
Let's go for it. Let me see. Do you want to read it out if you've already seen it?
Sure. Not sure if Stephen has any specific knowledge on this topic, but to what extent do you believe Aragorn may have been inspired by British officers in the trenches of World War I? Well, it's a good question because a lot of British officers were appointed based on their family and whether they could buy in, not because of their leadership ability. There's no doubt that Tolkien had experience in the trenches, and he did have people he respected in there. So if it was inspired by British officers, it was particular British officers, probably not the general British officer.
Oh, fair enough. You know, often World War I is, okay, I'm stopping myself right there before we go down that rabbit hole. We can talk about it for hours. So on that note, our weekly corner with Karen is going to read for us again. And this time she's chosen Neil Gaiman's We Can Get It For You Wholesale to read for us. Good evening, Karen.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can definitely hear you okay. We're going to hear you for a while now.
Yes.
So, tell us a bit about this story and why you chose it. There is always some story there. And with that, I'll just let you start reading.
Yes, so this is a story, as Gadi mentioned, by Neil Gaiman, who has been kind enough to open up the rights to sharing his work during the coronavirus crisis. So thanks to Neil Gaiman for that. I chose this story because after a conversation about a very remarkable man, Aragorn, who is nevertheless has the common touch, if you would put it, I think this is a story about a rather common fellow altogether, brushing with the great and terrible that in the world. So with that intro, we can get them for you wholesale by Neil Gaiman. Peter Pinter had never heard of Aristippus of the Cyrenaics, a lesser-known follower of Socrates who maintained that the avoidance of trouble was the highest attainable good. However, he had lived his uneventful life according to this precept. In all respects except one, an inability to pass up a bargain, and which of us is entirely free from that, he was a very moderate man. He did not go to extremes. His speech was proper and reserved. He rarely overate. He drank enough to be sociable and no more. He was far from rich and in no wise poor. He liked people and people liked him. Bearing all that in mind, would you expect to find him in a low-life pub on the seamier side of London's East End, taking out what is colloquially known as a contract on someone he hardly knew? You would not even expect to find him in the pub. And until a certain Friday afternoon, you would have been right. But the love of a woman can do strange things to a man, even one so colorless as Peter Pinter. And the discovery that Miss Gwendolyn Thorpe, 23 years of age, of 9 Oakland Terrace, Purley, was messing about, as the vulgar would put it, with a smooth young gentleman from the accounting department. After, mark you, she had consented to wear an engagement ring composed of real ruby chips, 9-carat gold, and something that might well have been a diamond, 3750 pounds, that it had taken Peter almost an entire lunch hour to choose. Can do very strange things to a man indeed. After he had made this shocking discovery, Peter spent a sleepless Friday night, tossing and turning with visions of Gwendolyn and Archie Gibbons, the Don Juan of the Clamage's accounting department, dancing and swimming before his eyes, performing acts that even Peter, if he were pressed, would have to admit were most improbable. But the bile of jealousy had risen up within him, and by the morning Peter had resolved that his rival should be done away with. Saturday morning was spent wondering how one contacted an assassin, for, to the best of Peter's knowledge, none were employed by Clemages, the department store that employed all 3 of the members of our eternal triangle and incidentally furnished the ring. And he was wary of asking anyone outright for fear of attracting attention to himself. Thus it was that Saturday afternoon found him hunting through the yellow pages. Assassins, he found, was not between asphalt contractors and assessors quantity. Killers was not between kennels and kindergartens. Murderers was not between mowers and museums. Pest control looked promising. However, closer investigation of the pest control advertisements showed them to be almost solely concerned with rats, mice, fleas, cockroaches, rabbits, moles, and rats, to quote from one that Peter felt was rather hard on rats, and not really what he had in mind. Even so, being of a careful nature, he dutifully inspected the entries in that category, and at the bottom of the second page in small print, he found a firm that looked promising. Complete discreet disposal of irksome and unwanted mammals, etc., went the entry. Ketch, Hare, Burke, and Ketch, the old firm. It went on to give no address, but only a phone number. Peter dialed the number, surprising himself by doing so. His heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to look nonchalant. The telephone rang once, twice, 3 times. Peter was just starting to hope that it would not be answered and he could forget the whole thing when there was a click, and a brisk young female voice said, "Ketch, Hare, Burke, and Ketch, how can I help you?" Careful not to give his name, Peter said, how big, what size mammals do you go up to dispose of? Well, that would all depend on what size sir requires. He plucked up all his courage. A person? Her voice remained brisk and unruffled. Of course, sir. Do you have a pen and paper handy? Good. Be at the Dirty Donkey Pub off Little Courtney Street, E3 tonight at 8 o'clock. Carry a rolled up copy of the Financial Times. That's the pink one, sir, and our operative will approach you there. And she put down the phone. Peter was elated. It had been far easier than he had imagined. He went down to the newsagents and bought a copy of the Financial Times, found Little Courtney Street in his A to Z of London, and spent the rest of the afternoon watching football on the television and imagining the smooth young gentleman from accounting's funeral. It took Peter a while to find the pub. Eventually he spotted the pub sign, which showed a donkey and was indeed remarkably dirty. The Dirty Donkey was a small and more or less filthy pub, poorly lit, in which knots of unshaven people wearing dusty donkey jackets stood around eyeing each other suspiciously, eating crisps and drinking pints of Guinness, a drink that Peter had never cared for. Peter set his Financial Times under one arm, as conspicuously as he could, but no one approached him, so he bought a half of shandy and retreated to a corner table. Unable to think of anything else to do while waiting, he tried to read the paper, but, lost and confused by a maze of grain futures and a rubber company that was selling something or other short, quite what the short somethings were he could not tell, he gave it up and stared at the door. He had waited almost 10 minutes when a small, busy man hustled in, looking quickly around him, then came straight over to Peter's table and sat down. He stuck out his hand. "Kemble. Burton Kemble of Ketch, Hare, Burke, Ketch. I hear you have a job for us." He didn't look like a killer. Peter said so. "Oh, Lord bless us, no. I'm not actually part of our workforce, sir. I'm in sales." Peter nodded. That certainly made sense. "Can we, talk freely here?" "Sure. Nobody's interested. Now then, how many people would you like disposed of?" Only one. His name's Archibald Gibbons, and he works in Clemage's accounting department. His address is," Kemble interrupted. "We can go into all that later, sir, if you don't mind. Let's just quickly go over the financial side. First of all, the contract will cost you £500. Peter nodded. He could afford that, and in fact had expected to have to pay a little more. Although there's always the special offer, Kemble concluded smoothly. Peter's eyes shone. As I mentioned earlier, he loved a bargain and often bought things he had no imaginable use for in sales or on special offers. Apart from this one failing, one that so many of us share, he was a most moderate young man. Special offer? 2 for the price of 1, sir. Peter thought about it. That worked out at only $2.50 each, which couldn't be bad no matter how you looked at it. There was only one snag. I'm afraid I don't have anyone else I want killed. Kemble looked disappointed. That's a pity, sir. For 2, we could probably have even knocked the price down to, well, say, £450 for the both of them. Really? Well, it gives our operative something to do, sir. If you must know, and here he dropped his voice, there really isn't enough work in this particular line to keep them occupied. Not like the old days. Isn't there just one other person you'd like to see dead? Peter pondered. He hated to pass up a bargain, but couldn't for the life of him think of anyone else. He liked people. Still, a bargain was a bargain. Look, said Peter, could I think about it and see you here tomorrow night? The salesman looked pleased. Of course, sir. I'm sure you'll be able to think of someone. The answer, the obvious answer, came to Peter as he was drifting off to sleep that night. He sat straight up in bed, fumbled the bedside lamp on, and wrote a name down on the back of the envelope in case he forgot it. To tell the truth, he didn't think he would forget it, for it was painfully obvious, but you could never tell with these late-night thoughts. The name that he had written down on the back of the envelope was this, Gwendolyn Thorpe. He turned the light off, rolled over, and was soon asleep, dreaming peaceful and remarkably unmurderous dreams. Kemble was waiting for him when he arrived in the Dirty Donkey on Sunday night. Peter bought a drink and sat down beside him. I'm taking you up on the special offer, he said, by way of greeting. Kemble nodded vigorously. A very wise decision, if you don't mind me saying so, sir. Peter Pinter smiled modestly in the manner of one who read the Financial Times and made wise business decisions. That will be £450, I believe? Did I say £450, sir? Good gracious me, I do apologize. I beg your pardon. I was thinking of our bulk rate. It would be $475 for 2 people. Disappointment mingled with cupidity on Peter's bland and youthful face. That was an extra £25. However, something that Kendall had said caught his attention. Bulk rate? Of course, but I doubt that sir would be interested in that. No, I am. Tell me about it. Very well, sir. Bulk rate, £450, would be for a large job, 10 people. Peter wondered if he'd heard correctly. 10 people? But that's only £45 each. Yes, sir, it's the large order that makes it profitable. I see, said Peter. And, said Peter. And could you be here at the same time tomorrow night? Of course, sir. Upon arriving home, Peter got out a scrap of paper and a pen. He wrote the numbers 1 to 10 down one side and then filled it in as follows. 1, Archie. 2, Gwenny. 3, and so forth. Having filled in the first 2, he sat sucking his pen, hunting for wrongs done to him and people the world would be better off without. He smoked a cigarette. He strolled around the room. Aha! There was a physics teacher at a school he had attended who was delighting in making his life a misery. What was the man's name again? And for that matter, was he still alive? Peter wasn't sure, but he wrote the physics teacher, Abbott Street Secondary School, next to the number 3. The next came more easily. His department head had refused to raise his salary a couple months back. That the raise had eventually come was immaterial. Mr. Hunterson was number 4. When he was 5, a boy named Simon Ellis had poured paint on his head, while another boy named James something or other had held him down, and a girl named Sharon Harpshire had laughed. There were numbers 5 through 7 respectively. Who else? There was the man on television with the annoying snicker who read the news. He went on the list. What about the woman in the flat next door with the little yappy dog that shat in the hall? He put her and the dog down on 9. 10 was the hardest. He scratched his head and went into the kitchen for a cup of coffee, then dashed back and wrote my great-uncle Mervyn down in the 10th place. The old man was rumored to be quite affluent, and there was a possibility, albeit rather slim, that he could leave Peter some money. With the satisfaction of an evening's work well done, he went off to bed. Monday at Clamage's was routine. Peter was a senior sales assistant in the books department, a job that actually entailed very little. He clutched his list tightly in his hand, deep in his pocket, rejoicing in the feeling of power that it gave him. He spent a most enjoyable lunch hour in the canteen with young Gwendolyn, who did not know that he had seen her and Archie enter the stockroom together, and even smiled at the smooth young man from the accounting department when he passed him in the corridor. He proudly displayed his list to Kemble that evening. The little salesman's face fell. I'm afraid this isn't 10 people, Mr. Pinter, he exclaimed. You've counted the woman in the next door flat and her dog is 1 person. That brings it to 11, which would be an extra, his pocket calculator was rapidly deployed, an extra £70. How about if we forget the dog? Peter shook his head. The dog's as bad as the woman, or worse. And I'm afraid we have a slight problem, unless, what? Unless you'd like to take advantage of our wholesale rate. But of course, sir, wouldn't be. There are words that do things to people. Words that make people's faces flush with joy, excitement, or passion. Environmental can be one. Occult is another. Wholesale was Peter's. He leaned back in his chair. Tell me about it, he said, with the practiced assurance of an experienced shopper. Well, sir, said Kemble, allowing himself a little chuckle, we can get them for you wholesale. £17.50 each for every quarry after the first 50, or a tenner each for everyone over 200. I suppose you'd go down to a $5 if I wanted 1,000 people knocked off? Oh, no, sir, Kemble looked shocked. If you're talking those sorts of figures, we can do them for a quid each. £1? That's right, sir. There's not a big profit margin on it, but the high turnover and productivity more than justifies it. Kemble got up. Same time tomorrow, sir? Peter nodded. £1,000. 1,000 people. Peter Pinter didn't even know 1,000 people. Even so, there were the Houses of Parliament. He didn't like politicians. They squabbled and argued and carried on so, and for that matter, an idea. Shocking in its audacity. Bold, daring. Still, the idea was there and it wouldn't go away. A distant cousin of his had married the younger brother of an earl or a baron or something. On the way home from work that afternoon, he stopped off at a little shop that he had passed 1,000 times without entering. It had a large sign in the window, guaranteeing to trace your lineage for you and even draw up a coat of arms if you happen to have mislaid your own, and an impressive heraldic map. Maybe now that the darkness had lifted from her mind, all she wanted was to be with her family again. They were very helpful and phoned him up just after 7 to give him their news. If approximately 14,072,811 people died, he, Peter Pinter, would be King of England. He didn't have 14,072,811 pounds, but he suspected that when you were talking in those figures, Mr. Kemble would have one of his special discounts. Mr. Kemble did. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. Actually, he explained, it works out quite cheaply. You see, we wouldn't have to do them all individually. Small-scale nuclear weapons, some judicious bombing, gassing, plague, dropping radios in swimming pools, and then mopping up the stragglers. Say 4,000 pounds. That's incredible. The salesman looked pleased with himself. Our operatives will be glad of the work, sir, he grinned. We pride ourselves on servicing our wholesale customers. The wind blew cold as Peter left the pub, setting the old sign swinging. It didn't look much like a dirty donkey, thought Peter, more like a pale horse. Peter was drifting off to sleep that night, mentally rehearsing his coronation speech, when a thought drifted into his head and hung around. It would not go away. Could he possibly be passing up on an even larger saving than he already had? Could he be missing out on a bargain? Peter climbed out of bed and walked over to the phone. It was almost 3 a.m., but even so, his yellow pages lay open where he had left it the previous Saturday, and he dialed the number. The phone seemed to ring forever. There was a click and a bored voice said, "Burke Hair Catch, can I help you?" "I hope I'm not phoning too late," he began. "Of course not, sir. I was wondering if I could speak to Mr. Kemble. Can you hold? I'll see if he's available." Peter waited for a couple of minutes, listening to the ghostly crackles and whispers that always echo down empty phone lines. "Are you there, caller?" "Yes, I'm there. Putting you through." There was a buzz, then. "Kemble speaking." Mr. Kemble, hello. Sorry if I got you out of bed or anything. This is, Peter Pinter." "Yes, Mr. Pinter?" "Well, I'm sorry it's so late, only I was wondering, how much would it cost to kill everybody? Everybody in the world?" "Everybody? All the people?" "Yes, how much? I mean, for an order like that, you'd have to have some kind of a big discount. How much would it be for everyone?" "Nothing at all, Mr. Pinter." "You mean you wouldn't do it?" "I mean, we'd do it for nothing, Mr. Pinter. Well, we only have to be asked, you see. We always have to be asked." Peter was puzzled. "But when would you start?" "Start? Right away, now. We've been ready for a long time, but we had to be asked, Mr. Pinter." "Good night. It has been a pleasure doing business with you." The line went dead. Peter felt strange. Everything seemed very distant. He wanted to sit down. What on earth had the man meant? We always have to be asked. It was definitely strange. Nobody does anything for nothing in this world. He had a good mind to phone Kemble back and call the whole thing off. Perhaps he'd overreacted. Perhaps there was a perfectly innocent reason why Archie and Gwendolyn had entered the stockroom together. He would talk to her. That's what he would do. He'd talk to Gwenny first thing tomorrow morning. That was when the noises started. Odd cries from across the street. A cat fight? Foxes, probably. He hoped someone would throw a shoe at them. Then, from the corridor outside his flat, he heard a muffled clumping, as if someone were dragging something very heavy along the floor. It stopped. Someone knocked on his door, twice, very softly. Outside his window, the cries were getting louder. Peter sat in his chair, knowing that somehow, somewhere, he had missed something important. The knocking redoubled. He was thankful that he'd always locked and chained his door at night. They'd been ready for a long time, but they had to be asked. When the thing came through the door, Peter started screaming, but he really didn't scream for very long. The end.
Thank you for that, Karen, as always.
Of
Appreciate it.
The end of both Peter and the world.